Welcome back to London, global capital of finance, art, and culture. And as I'm about to discover, of modern street fashion and contemporary haute couture. The historic Victoria and Albert Museum in London houses the largest collection of applied and decorative arts on the planet. Among the more than 2 million objects on display within this massive museum complex is the most complete and authoritative anthology of British fashion ever put together. An extensive gallery of clothing, footwear, and accessories spanning 4 centuries of fashion trends and movements. If you're curious why London is one of the most creative and dynamic fashion capitals, this is a great place to investigate. Much of the collection is represented by the styles worn by Britain's social elite. But you could skip that and head straight to the contemporary section, where London's current status as a global leader in edgy streetwear and avant-garde couture was cemented by British designers like Mary Quant, Vivienne Westwood, and Alexander McQueen. As fantastic as the V&A is, the ultimate fashion museum is the streets of London itself, a virtual catwalk where the city's mod, punk, glam rock, and new romantic subcultures have inspired trends on the runway for decades. John Herrera is a Filipino designer based in London. Named Britain's top designer at the London Fashion Week in 2017, he walks me through some of the city's legendary fashion streets and iconic boutiques. Carnaby Street among them, where London's iconic mod and hippie styles and brands like Ben Sherman and Dr. Martens flourished in the 60s and 70s.
This is like the epicenter of mod.
Yeah, but back in the 60s, yeah, but back in the 60s, it was like, yeah, the factory of the ideas of the punk, the mod, the shorts or the miniskirts.
Okay.
Yeah, the onesies, everything. Sexual revolution was here.
This was the 60s, the counterculture. This is where it all began in fashion.
Yeah, Vogue Fashion Editor once said London is when young people decided to come to life instead of waiting for life to come to them.
London's youth counterculture was key to creating a new fashion movement to challenge the established brands of the elite. And none did that better than Vivienne Westwood, whose punk-inspired clothing line was, and still is, like flashing a middle finger to the British aristocracy.
She is the pioneer of that whole aesthetic.
Yes, and when she started, she wasn't even a proper designer. When she started, she was dressing up a band called Sex Pistols.
Yeah.
So a lot of designers look up to her, even the designers who are the heads of fashion houses today, like Christopher Kane, House of Fallen, Alexander McQueen, John Galliano, they would tell you that they're big fans of Vivienne Westwood because she started it all.
Indeed, rebelliousness has become synonymous with British style. Ironically, it's London's anti-establishment designers who elevated streetwear to high fashion. You'll even find their boutiques along Bond Street, London's most exclusive shopping address.
So you took me here to Old Bond Street, and we're standing right outside Alexander McQueen.
Well, Alexander McQueen is very important now in the history of fashion in the last 20 years. Because he is from the 90s, and he was able to do what a great brand like Vivienne Westwood was able to do back in the 70s. He was able to bring something even from the underground culture, which is skulls and things that are morose and grotesque, and he was able to bring it to the forefront of fashion, but even to a certain level of haute couture.
But there's that element of being on the edge, being a bit avant-garde, which British fashion is famous for, right?
Yeah, the more I study about British fashion and its importance in the global fashion history, what I notice is there's a certain hint of rebellion every now and then. I think it's because people are rebelling against the monarchs.
Strangely, the late Princess Diana was a big fan of Alexander McQueen, and so is Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge. But that's the enigma of British fashion. radical chic, like Stella McCartney's own brand suggests. The daughter of the former Beatle is known for her commitment to animal rights and ecologically responsible clothing. In London, it seems, rebellion and fashion go together perfectly and profitably. Even heritage brands like Burberry are onto it.
So here we are, Burberry, and it's announcing itself as a really British brand.
You can't get more British than the Union Jack.
I know Burberry for its trench coats. This is the stuff that the Queen would wear.
Yeah, the brown trench coat.
But it's become quite hip, hasn't it?
Yes, because a lot of the designers recently, like Christopher Kane, have amped it up a little bit. Putting the sneakers, like, you know, back in the 90s, you would never think a brand like Burberry would ever have large sneakers. Yeah. But, you know, they all do the same thing now because it's the trend. You have to get on it to be relevant.
The ability to break with convention to set new trends may be the London fashion scene's edge. But it's the old-fashioned values you find in the bespoke tailoring houses of Savile Row a few streets away that make the top British brands of London so successful.
So, when you get down to it, what would you say is the DNA of a British fashion brand? Whether it's a Savile Row brand, a heritage brand like Burberry, or something younger and edgier like Alexander McQueen?
Well, if I have to pinpoint it, which is so difficult nowadays, I think it has to be tailoring. Whether it's deconstructed, it's punk, it's glamorous, it's the opposite, it's rigid, rancid, it has to start with tailoring. I think British tailoring is their gift to the world.
The mix of creativity and craftsmanship is indeed a hallmark of British fashion, plus that ability to attract top talent from all over the globe. John Herrera is one of many foreign designers who, like Leslie Mobo, have found a creative space in London. I'm meeting with a sensational Filipino fashion designer at Romulo Cafe along Kensington High Street in a tony part of London. The Filipino restaurant represents one of several ethnic culinary traditions in a city that embraces immigrants better than most other European capitals. No wonder Leslie, who cut his teeth at the elite fashion school Central St. Martin's and designed for Harrods among other British brands, considers London his new home.
So it's been a long time. I think it was 2002 when I first came over and interviewed you. You're like a graduating student. And wow, your career has just like gone from strength to strength since then. And how much of it can you credit to London, being in London?
Well, how much of it? Well, I think a lot of it is actually probably, I don't know, I feel like London sort of embraced my talent somehow. I think talent is universal. I think it has to be original for people to acknowledge it, I suppose. So I don't think it's a particular London thing. I think London is the place where they train you, they break you, they build you up, and then after that they distribute to the different cities and stuff like that.
The designer of the famous Bond girl gown was invited by top fashion houses to relocate to Paris and Milan, but he finds London's creative atmosphere more satisfying, at least for an independent artist like him.
I'm glad that I stayed, but I could have actually moved somewhere else because usually the common practice you move to different sort of fashion capitals, but I stick to London because
this is your ecosystem.
I don't know, it ended up to be like my environment really, but I don't know, I just love London.
He's not alone. London is one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world, with more than 300 languages spoken. Almost half the population was born overseas, with more arriving every year to find work, raise a family, and experience the exciting street life and entertainment scene of this modern metropolis. In places like the West End, with the street-side attractions of Covent Garden and the lights of the world-famous theatre district, lure visitors and locals alike to this vibrant corner of London.
This is Covent Garden, and it's really popular with young Londoners and of course tourists as well. It's also one of the highlights of a West End walk.
The former fruit and vegetable market is one of the busiest shopping and entertainment districts in the city. and a few steps away from the world-famous opera house and theaters in the area.
A typical evening in the West End would be similar to that in Broadway in New York. Cocktails and dinner before or after a show. In fact, the West End even has its own New York institution.
Originally from Manhattan, the Joe Allen Brasserie in Covent Garden is a great place to dine before catching one of the musicals in the area. The sophisticated New York-style menu is fabulous. No wonder the place is always packed.
The food here is good, it's reasonable, but that's not the only reason why people come here. They come here to imbibe the whole West End theater vibe. And to people watch as well. Who knows, a theater actor might just walk in the restaurant.
The brasserie is frequented by actors, directors, and producers from the theaters nearby. It's fondly called West End's Canteen. It was once considered reckless to wander around this side of the West End unaccompanied at night, but the area has since been gentrified, like so many other parts of London today. After centuries of constant but predictable growth, the last 3 decades have seen London changing faster than any other time in recent memory. It's hard to tell what the city will look like in 10 years, but if the latest developments are any indication, it will certainly be exciting. In the second part of our series on London, we shift our gaze to a side of the city unperturbed by change. The London of royal palaces and grand dam hotels, of aristocratic traditions and bespoke fashion. Until then, see you next time.
And that's all for this episode of Executive Class. I'm David Celdran in London. Thanks for watching.